The Everlasting Man, Part 7. One of the great philosophers said that it would be well if philosophers were kings, or kings were philosophers. He spoke as of something too good to be true, but, as a matter of fact, it not infrequently was true. A certain type, perhaps too little noticed in history, may really be called the royal philosopher. To begin with, apart from actual royalty, it did occasionally become possible for the sage, though he was not what we would call a religious founder, to be something like a political founder. And the great example of this, one of the greatest in the world, will with that very thought of it carry us thousands of miles across vast spaces of Asia to that very wonderful and in some ways very wise world of ideas and institutions, which we dismiss somewhat cheaply when we talk of China. Men have served very many strange gods, and trusted themselves loyally to many ideals and even idols. China is a society that has really chosen to believe in intellect. It has taken intellect seriously, and it may be that it stands alone in the world. From a very early age, it faced the dilemma of the king and the philosopher by actually appointing a philosopher to advise the king. It made a public institution out of a private individual who had nothing in the world to do but to be intellectual. It has and had, of course, many other things on the same pattern. It creates all ranks and privileges by public examination. It has nothing that we call an aristocracy. It is a democracy dominated by an intelligentsia. But the point here is that it had philosophers to advise kings, and one of those philosophers must have been a great philosopher and a great statesman. Confucius was not a religious founder or even a religious teacher, possibly not even a religious man. He was not an atheist. He was apparently what we call an agnostic. But the really vital point is that it is utterly irrelevant to talk about his religion at all. It is like talking of theology as the first thing in the story of how Rowland Hill established the postal system, or Baden-Powell organized the Boy Scouts. Confucius was not there to bring a message from heaven to humanity, but to organize China, and he must have organized it exceedingly well. It follows that he dealt much with morals, but he bound them up strictly with manners. The peculiarity of his scheme and of his country, in which it contrasts with its great pendant, the system of Christendom, is that he insisted on perpetuating an external life with all its forms, that outward continuity might preserve internal peace. Anyone who knows how much habit has to do with health of mind as well as body will see the truth in this idea. But he will also see that ancestor worship and the reverence for the sacred emperor were habits and not creeds. It is unfair to the great Confucius to say that he was a religious founder. It is even unfair to him to say he was not a religious founder. It is unfair as going out of one's way to say that Jeremy Bentham was not a Christian martyr. But there is a class of most interesting cases in which philosophers were kings, but not merely the friends of kings. The combination is not accidental. It has a great deal to do with this rather elusive question of the function of the philosopher. It contains in it some hint of why philosophy and mythology seldom came to an open rupture. It was not only because there was something a little frivolous about the mythology, it was also because there was something a little supercilious about the philosopher. He despised the myths, but he also despised the mob, and thought they suited each other. The pagan philosopher was seldom a man of the people, at any rate in spirit. He was seldom a democrat and often a bitter critic of democracy. He had about him an air of aristocratic and humane leisure, and his part was most easily played by men who happened to be in such a position. This was very easy and natural for a prince or a prominent person to play at being as philosophical as Hamlet or Theseus in Midsummer's Night's Dream. And from very early stages we find ourselves in the presence of these princely intellectuals. In fact, we find one of them in the very first recorded ages of the world, sitting on the primeval throne that looked over ancient Egypt. The most intense interest of the incident of Akhenaten, commonly called the heretic pharaoh, lies in the fact that he was the one example, at any rate before Christian times, and one of these royal philosophers who set himself to fight popular mythology in the name of private philosophy. Most of them assumed the attitude of Marcus Aurelius, who is in many ways the model of this sort of monarch and sage. Marcus Aurelius has been blamed for tolerating the pagan amphitheater or the Christian martyrdoms, but it was characteristic. For this sort of man really thought of popular religion just as he thought of popular circuses. Of him, Professor Phillimore has profoundly said, "A great and good man, and he knew it." The heretic pharaoh had a philosophy more earnest and perhaps more humble, for there is a corollary to the conception of being too proud to fight. It is that the humble have to do most of the fighting. It is that the humble have to do most of the fighting. Anyhow, the Egyptian prince was simple enough to take his own philosophy seriously, and alone among intellectual princes he effected a sort of coup d'etat, hurling down the high gods of Egypt with one imperial gesture and lifting up for all men, like a blazing mirror of monotheistic truth, the disk of the universal sun. He had other interesting ideas often to be found in such idealists. In the sense in which we speak of a little Englander, he was a little Egypter. In art he was a realist because he was an idealist, for realism is more impossible than any other ideal. But after all, there falls on him something of a shadow of Marcus Aurelius, stalked by the shadow of Professor Phillimore. That is the matter with this noble sort of prince is that he has nowhere quite escaped being something of a prig. Priggishness is so pungent of smell that it clings amid the faded spices even to an Egyptian mummy. That was the matter with the heretic Pharaoh, as with a good many other heretics, was that he probably never paused to ask himself whether there was anything in the popular beliefs and tales of people less educated than himself. And, as already suggested, there was something in them. There was a real human hunger in all that element of feature and locality, that procession of deities like enormous pet animals, in that unwearied watching at certain haunted spots, in all the many wanderings of mythology. Nature may not have the name of Isis. Isis may not really be looking for Osiris. But it is true that nature is really looking for something. Nature is always looking for the supernatural. Something much more definite was to satisfy that need, but a dignified monarch with a disk of the sun did not satisfy it. The royal experiment failed amid a roaring reaction of popular superstitions, in which the priests rose on the shoulders of the people and ascended the throne of the kings. The next great example I shall take of the princely sage is Gautama, the great Lord Buddha. I know he is not generally classed merely with the philosophers, but I am more and more convinced from all the information that reaches me that this is the real interpretation of his immense importance. He was by far the greatest and the best of these intellectuals born in the purple. His reaction was perhaps the noblest and most sincere of all the resultant actions of that combination of thinkers and of thrones. For his reaction was renunciation. Marcus Aurelius was content to say, with a refined irony, that even in a palace life could be lived well. The fiery the firier Egyptian king concluded that it could be lived even better after a palace revolution. But the great Gautama was only one of them who proved he could really do without his palace. One fell back on toleration and the other on revolution. But after all, there is something more absolute about abdication. Abdication is perhaps the one really absolute action of an absolute monarch. The Indian prince, reared in oriental luxury and pomp, deliberately went out and lived the life of a beggar. That is magnificent, but it is not war. That is, it is not necessarily a crusade in the Christian sense. It does not decide the question of whether the life of a beggar was the life of a saint or the life of a philosopher. It does not decide whether this great man is really to go into the tub of Diogenes or the cave of St. Jerome. Now those who seem to be nearest to the study of Buddha, and certainly those who write most clearly and intelligently about him, convince me, for one, that he was simply a philosopher who found a successful school of philosophy, and was turned into a sort of divus, or sacred being, merely by the more mysterious and unscientific atmosphere of all such traditions in Asia. So that it is necessary to say at this point a word about that invisible yet vivid borderline that we cross in passing from the Mediterranean into the mystery of the East. Perhaps There are no things out there which we get so little of the truth as the truisms, especially when they are really true. We are all in the habit of saying certain things about Asia which are true enough, but which hardly help us because we do not understand their truth, as that Asia is old, or looks to the past, or is not progressive. Now it is true that Christendom is more progressive, in the sense that it has little to do with the rather provincial notion of an endless fuss of political improvement. Christendom does believe, for Christianity does believe, that man can eventually get somewhere, here or hereafter, or in various ways according to various doctrines. The world's desire can somehow be satisfied, as desires are satisfied, whether by a new life, or an old love, or some form of positive possession and fulfillment. For the rest, we all know there is a rhythm and not a mere progress of things, that things rise and fall. Only with us the rhythm is a fairly free and incalculable rhythm. For most of Asia the rhythm has hardened into a recurrence. It is no longer merely a rather topsy-turvy sort of world. It is a wheel. What has happened to all those highly intelligent and highly civilized peoples is that they have been caught up in a sort of cosmic rotation, of which the hollow hub is really nothing. In that sense, the worst part of existence is that it may just as well go on like that forever. That is what we really mean when we say that Asia is old or unprogressive or looking backwards. That is why we see even her curved swords as arcs broken from the blinding wheel, why we see her serpentine ornament as returning everywhere, like a snake that is never slain. It has very little to do with political varnish of progress. All Asiatics might have top hats on their heads, but if they had this spirit still in their hearts, they would only think that the hats would vanish and come around again like the planets, not that running after a hat could lead them to heaven or even to home. Now when the genius of Buddha arose to deal with the matter, this sort of cosmic sentiment was already common to almost everything in the East. There was indeed a jungle of extraordinary, extravagant, and almost asphyxiating mythology. Nevertheless, it is possible to have more sympathy with this popular fruitfulness in folklore than with some of the higher pessimism that might have withered it. It must always be remembered, however, when all fair allowances were made, that a great deal of spontaneous Eastern imagery really is idolatry, the local and literal worship of an idol. This is probably not true of the ancient Brahminical system, at least as seen by Brahmins. But that phrase alone will remind us of a reality of much greater moment. This great reality is the caste system of ancient India. It may have some of the practical advantages of the guild system of medieval Europe, but it contrasts not only with that Christian democracy, but with every extreme type of Christian aristocracy, and in the fact that it does really conceive the social superiority as spiritual superiority. This not only divides it fundamentally from the fraternity of Christendom, but leaves it standing like a mighty and terraced mountain of pride between the relatively egalitarian levels of both Islam and of China. But the fixity of this formation through thousands of years is another illustration of that spirit of repetition that has marked time from time immemorial. Now we may also presume the prevalence of another idea which we associate with the Buddhists as interpreted by the theosophists. As a fact, some of the strictest Buddhists repudiate the idea and still more scornfully repudiate the theosophists. But whether the idea is in Buddhism or only in the birthplace of Buddhism, or only in a tradition or a travesty of Buddhism, it is an idea entirely proper to this principle of recurrence. I mean, of course, the idea of reincarnation. But reincarnation is not really a mystical idea. It is not really a transcendental idea, or in that sense a religious idea. Mysticism conceives something transcending experience. Religion seeks glimpses of a better good or a worse evil than experience can give. Reincarnation need only extend experiences in the sense of repeating them. It is no more transcendental for a man to remember what he did in Babylon before he was born than to remember what he did in Brighton before he had a knock on the head. His successive lives need not be any more than human lives, under whatever limitations burden human life. It has nothing to do with seeing God or even conjuring up the devil. In other words, reincarnation as such does not necessarily escape from the wheel of destiny. In some sense, it is the wheel of destiny. And whether it was something that Buddha founded, or something that Buddha found, or something that Buddha entirely renounced when he found, it is certainly something having a general character of that Asiatic atmosphere in which he had to play his part. And the part he played was that of an intellectual philosopher, with a particular theory about the right intellectual attitude towards it. I can understand that Buddhists might resent the view that Buddhism is merely a philosophy, if we understand by a philosophy merely an intellectual game such as Greek sophists played, tossing up worlds and catching them like balls. Perhaps a more exact statement would be that Buddha was a man who made a metaphysical discipline, which might even be called a psychological discipline. He proposed a way of escaping from all this recurrent sorrow, and that was simply by getting rid of the delusion that is called desire. It was emphatically not that we should get what we want better by restraining our impatience for the part of it, or that we should get it in a way better or in a better world. It was emphatically that we should leave off wanting it. If once a man realized that there is really no reality, that everything, including his soul, is in disillusion at every instant, he would anticipate disappointment and be intangible to change, existing, insofar as he could be said to exist, in a sort of ecstasy of indifference. The Buddhists call this beatitude, and will not stop our story to argue the point. Certainly, to us, it is indistinguishable from despair. I do not see, for instance, why the disappointment of desire should not apply as much to the most benevolent desires as to the most selfish ones. Indeed, the Lord of Compassion seems to pity people for living rather than for dying. And the rest, an intelligent Buddhist wrote, the explanation of popular Chinese and Japanese Buddhism is that it is not Buddhism. That has doubtless ceased to be a mere philosophy, but only by becoming a mere mythology. One thing is certain, it has never become anything remotely resembling what we call a church. It will appear only a jest to say that all religious history has been a pattern of noughts and crosses. But I do not by noughts mean nothings, but only things that are negative compared with the positive shape or pattern of the other. And though the symbol is of course only a coincidence, it is a coincidence that really does coincide. The mind of Asia can really be represented by the round O, if not in the sense of a cipher, at least of a circle. The great Asiatic symbol of a serpent with its tail in its mouth is really a very perfect image of a certain idea of unity and recurrence that does indeed belong to the Eastern philosophies and religions. It really is a curve that in one sense includes everything, and in another sense comes to nothing. In that sense it does confess, or rather boast, that all argument is an argument in a circle. And though the figure is but a symbol, we can see how sound is the symbolic sense that produced it. The parallel symbol of the wheel of Buddha, generally called the swastika. The cross is a thing at right angles, pointed boldly in opposite directions. But the swastika is the same thing in the very act of returning to the recurrent curve. That crooked cross is in fact a cross turning into a wheel. Before we dismiss even these symbols as if they were arbitrary symbols, we must remember how intense was the imaginative instinct that produced them, or selecting them both in the East and the West. The cross has become something more than a historical memory. It does convey, almost as by a mathematical diagram, the truth about the real point at issue. The idea of a conflict stretching outward into eternity. It is true, and even tautological, to say that the cross is the crux of the whole matter. In other words, the cross, in fact as well as figure, does really stand for the idea of breaking out of the circle, that is, everything and nothing. It does escape from the circular argument by which everything begins and ends in the mind. Since we are still dealing in symbols, it might be put in a parable in the form of that story about St. Francis, which says that the birds departing with his benediction would wing their way into the infinities of the four winds of heaven, their tracks making a vast cross upon the sky. For compared with the freedom of that flight of birds, the very shape of the swastika is like a kitten chasing its tail. In a more popular allegory, we might say that when St. George thrust his spear into the monster's jaws, he broke in upon the solitude of the self-devouring serpent and gave it something to bite besides its own tail. But while many fancies might be used as figures of the truth itself is abstract and absolute, though it is not very easy to sum up except by such figures. Christianity does appeal to a solid truth outside itself, to something which is in that sense external as well as eternal. It does declare that things are really there, or in other words, that things are really things. In this, Christianity is at one with common sense. But all religious history shows that this common sense perishes, except where there is Christianity to preserve it. It cannot otherwise exist, or at least endure, because the mere thought does not remain sane. In a sense, it becomes too simple to be sane. The temptation of the philosophers is simplicity rather than subtlety. They are always attracted by insane simplifications, as men poised above abysses are fascinated by death and nothingness and empty air. It indeed another kind of philosopher to stand poised upon the pinnacle of the temple and keep his balance without casting himself down. One of these two obvious explanations is everything is a dream and a delusion, and there is nothing outside the ego. Another is that all things recur. Another, which is said to be a Buddhist and is certainly Oriental, is the idea that what is the matter with us is our creation, in the sense of our colored differentiation and personality, and that nothing will be well till we are again melted into one unity. By this theory, in short, the creation was the fall. It is important historically because it was stored up in the dark heart of Asia and went forth at various times in various forms over the dim borders of Europe. Here we can place the mysterious figure of Manes, or Manichaeus, the mystic of inversion, whom we should call a pessimist, parent of many sects and heresies. Here, in a higher place, the figure of Zoroaster. He had been popularly identified with another of these two simple explanations, the equality of evil and good, balanced and battling in every atom. He also is of the school of sages that may be called mystics, and from the same mysterious Persian garden came upon the ponderous wings Mithras, the unknown god, to trouble the last twilight of Rome. That circle or disk of the sun set up in the morning of the world by the remote Egyptian has been a mirror and a model for all the philosophers. They have made many things out of it, sometimes gone mad about it, especially when, as in these Eastern sages, the circle becomes a wheel going round and round in their heads. But the point about them is that they all think that existence can be represented by a diagram instead of a drawing, and the rude drawings of the childish myth-makers are a sort of crude and spirited protest against that view. They cannot believe that religion is really not a pattern, but a picture. Still less they cannot believe that it is a picture of something that really exists outside our minds. Sometimes the philosophy paints the disk all black and calls himself a pessimist. Sometimes he paints it all white and calls himself an optimist. Sometimes he divides it exactly into halves of black and white and calls himself a dualist, like those Persian mystics to whom I wish there were space to do justice. None of them could understand a thing that began to draw the proportions just as if they were real proportions, disposed in the living fashion which the mathematical draftsman would call disproportionate. Like the first artist in the cave, It revealed to incredulous eyes the suggestion of a new purpose in what looked like a wildly crooked pattern. He seemed only to be distorting his diagram when he began for the first time in all ages to trace the lines of a form and of a face. Chapter 7. The War of the Gods and Demons. The materialist theory of history, that all politics and ethics are the expression of economics, is a very simple fallacy indeed. It consists simply of confusing the necessary conditions of life with the normal preoccupations of life, that are quite a different thing. It is like saying that because a man can only walk about on two legs, therefore he never walks about except to buy shoes and stockings. Man cannot live without the two props of food and drink, which support him like two legs. But to suggest that they have been the motives of all his movements in history is like saying that the goal of all his military marches or religious pilgrimages must have been the golden leg of Miss Kilmansegg, or the idea and perfect leg of Sir Willoughby Patterne. But it is such movements that make up a story of mankind. Without them, there would practically be no story at all. Cows may be purely economic, in the sense that we cannot see that they do much beyond grazing and seeking better grazing grounds. And that is why a history of cows in 12 columns would not be very lively reading. Sheep and goats may be pure economists, in their external action at least, but that is why the sheep has hardly been a hero of epic wars and empires thought worthy of detailed narration. And even the more active quadruped has not inspired a book for boys called Golden Deeds of Gallant Goats, or any similar title. But so far from the movements that make up the story of man being economic, we may say that the story only begins where the motive of the cows and sheep leave off. It will be hard to maintain that the Crusaders went from their homes into a howling wilderness because cows go from a wilderness to a more comfortable grazing grounds. It will be hard to maintain that the Arctic explorers went north with the same material motive that made the swallows go south. And if you leave things like all religious wars, and all the merely adventurous explorations out of the human story, it will not only cease to be human at all, but to cease to be a story at all. The outline of history is made of these decisive curves and angles determined by the will of man. Economic history would not even be history. But there is a deeper fallacy besides this obvious fact, that men need not live for food merely because they cannot live without food. The truth is that the thing most present to the mind of man is not the economic machinery necessary to his existence, but rather that existence itself, the world with which he sees when he wakes every morning, and the nature of his general position in it. There is something that is nearer to him than livelihood, and that is life. For once he remembered exactly what work produces his wages, and exactly what wages produces his meals. He reflects 10 times that it is a fine day, or it is a queer world, or wonders whether life is worth living, or wonders whether marriage is a failure, or is pleased and puzzled with his own children, or remembers his own youth, or in any such fashion vaguely reviews the mysterious lot of man. This is true of the majority, even of the wage slaves of our morbid modern industrialism, which, by its hideousness and inhumanity, has really forced the economic issue to the front. It is immeasurably more true of the multitude of peasants or hunters or fishers who make up the real mass of mankind. Even those dry pedants who think that ethics depend on economics must admit that economics depend on existence. And any number of normal doubts and daydreams are about existence. Not about how we can live, but about why we do. And the proof of it is simple as suicide. Turn the universe upside down in the mind, and you turn all the political economists upside down with it. Suppose that a man wishes to die, and the professor of political economy becomes rather a bore with his elaborate explanations of how he is to live. And all the departures and decisions that make our human past into a story have this character of diverting the direct course of pure economics. As the economists may be excused from calculating the future salary of a suicide, so he may be excused from providing an age-old pension for a martyr. As he need not provide for the future of a martyr, so he need not provide for the family of a monk. His plan is modified in lesser and varying degrees by a man being a soldier and dying for his country, by a man being a peasant and especially loving his own land, by a man being more or less affected by any religion that forbids or allows him to do this or that. But all these come back not to an economic calculation about livelihood, but to an elemental outlook upon life. They all come back to what a man fundamentally feels when he looks forth from those strange windows which he calls eyes upon that strange vision that we call the world. No wise man will wish to bring more long words into the world, but it may be allowable to say that we need a new thing, which may be called psychological history. I mean the consideration of what things meant in the mind of man, especially an ordinary man, as distinct from what is defined or deduced merely from the official forms or political pronouncements. I have already touched on it in such a case as the totem, or indeed any other popular myth. It is not enough to be told that a tomcat was called a totem, especially when it was not called a totem. We want to know what it felt like. Was it like Whittington's cat, or like a witch's cat? Was its real name Pashtul or Puss in Boots? What is the sort of thing we need touching the nature of political and social relations? We want to know the real sentiment that was the social bond of many common men, as sane and selfish as we are. What did soldiers feel when they saw splendid in the sky that strange totem we call the golden eagle of the legions? What did vassals feel about those other totems, the lions or the leopards upon the shield of their lord? So long as we neglect this subjective side of history, which may more simply be called the inside of history, there will always be a certain limitation on that science which can better transcended by art. So long as the historian cannot do that, fiction will be truer than fact. There will be more reality in a novel, yes, even in a historical novel. In nothing is this new history needed so much as the psychology of war. Our history is stiff with official documents, public or private, which tell us nothing of the thing itself. At the worst, we only have official posters, which could not have been spontaneous precisely because they were official. At the best, we have only the secret diplomacy, which could not have been popular precisely because it was secret. Upon this one or other of these is based the historical judgment about the real reasons that sustained the struggle. Government fight for colonies or commercial rights. Governments fight about harbors or high tariffs. Governments fight for a gold mine or a pearl fishery. It seems sufficient to answer that governments do not fight at all. Why do the fighters fight? What is the psychology that sustains this terrible and wonderful thing called war? Nobody who knows anything of soldiers believes the silly notion of the Dons, that millions of men can be ruled by force, and if they were all to slack, it would be impossible to punish all the slackers, and the least little touch of slacking would lose a whole campaign in half a day. What did men really feel about the policy? If it be said that they accepted the policy from the politician, what did they feel about the politician? If the vassals warred blindly for their prince, what did those blind men see in their prince? There is something we all know which can only be rendered in an appropriate language as realpolitik. As a matter of fact, it is an almost insanely unreal politic. It is always stubbornly and stupidly repeating that men fight for material ends, without reflecting for a moment that the material ends are hardly ever material to the men who fight. In any case, no man will die for practical politics, just as no man will die for pay. Nero could not hire 100 Christians to be eaten by lions at a shilling an hour, for men will not be martyred for money. But the vision, called up by realpolitik, or realistic politics, is beyond example crazy and incredible. Does anybody in the world believe that soldier says, "My leg is nearly dropping off, but I shall go on till it drops, for after all I shall enjoy all the advantages of my government obtaining a warm water port in the Gulf of Finland"? Can anybody suppose that a clerk turned conscript says, "If I am gassed, I shall probably die in torments, but it is a comfort to reflect that, should I ever decide to become a pearl diver in the South Seas, that career is now open to me and my countrymen"? Materialistic history is the most madly incredible of all histories, and even of all romances. Whatever starts wars, the thing that sustains wars is something in the soul. That is something akin to religion. It is what men feel about life and about death. A man near to death is dealing directly with an absolute. It is nonsense to say that he is concerned only with relative and remote complications, that death in any case will end. If he is sustained by certain loyalties, they must be loyalties as simple as death. They are generally two ideas, which are only two sides of one idea. The first is the love of something said to be threatened, if it be only vaguely known as home. The second is dislike and defiance of some strange thing that threatens it. The first is far more philosophical than it sounds, though we need not discuss it here. A man does not want his national home destroyed or even changed, because he cannot even remember all the good things that go with it, just as he does not want his house burnt down, because he can hardly count all the things he would miss. Therefore he fights for what sounds like a hazy abstraction, but is really a house. But the negative side of it is quite as noble, as well as quite as strong. Men fight hardest when they feel that the foe is at once an old enemy and an eternal stranger, that his atmosphere is alien and antagonistic, as the French feel about the Prussian or the Eastern Christians about the Turk. If we say it is a difference of religion, people will drift into dreary bickerings about sects and dogmas. We will pity them and say it is a difference about death and daylight, a difference that does really come like a dark shadow between our eyes and the day. Men can think of this difference even at the point of death, for it is a difference about the meaning of life. Men are moved in these things by something far higher and holier than policy, by hatred. When men hung on in the darkest days of the Great War, suffering either in their bodies or in their souls for those they loved, they were long past caring about details of diplomatic objects as motives for their refusal to surrender. Of myself and those I knew best, I can answer for the vision that made surrender possible. It was the vision of the German emperor's face as he rode into Paris. This is not the sentiment which some of my idealistic friends describe as love. I am quite content to call it hatred, the hatred of hell and all its works, and to agree that as they do not believe in hell, they need not believe in hatred. But in the face of this prevalent prejudice, this long introduction has been unfortunately necessary to ensure an understanding of what is meant by a religious war. There is a religious war when two worlds meet. That is, when two visions of the world meet. Or, in more modern language, when two moral atmospheres meet. What is the one man's breath is the other man's poison. And it is vain to talk of giving a pestilence a place in the sun. And this is what we must understand, even at the expense of digression. If we would see what really happened in the Mediterranean, when the right athwart the rising of the Republic on the Tiber, a thing overtopping and disdaining it, dark with all the riddles of Asia and trailing all the tribes and dependencies of imperialism, came Carthage riding on the sea. The ancient religion of Italy was on the whole that mixture which we have considered under the head of mythology, save that where the Greeks had a natural turn for the mythology, the Latins seem to have had a real turn for a religion. Both multiplied gods, yet they sometimes seem to have multiplied them for the almost opposite reasons. It would seem sometimes that if the Greek polytheism branched and blossomed upward like the boughs of a tree, while the Italian polytheism ramified downward like the roots, perhaps it would be truer to say that the former branches lifted themselves lightly, bearing flowers, while the latter hung down, being heavy with fruit. I mean that the Latins seemed to multiply gods to bring them nearer to men, while the Greek gods rose and radiated outward into the morning sky. What strikes us in the Italian cults is their local and especially their domestic character. We gain the impression of divinities swarming about the house like flies, of deities clustering and clinging like bats about the pillars or the buildings like birds under the eaves. We have a vision of a god of roofs and a god of gateposts, of a god of doors and even a god of drains. It has been suggested that all mythology was a sort of fairy tale, but this was a particular sort of fairy tale which may truly be called a fireside tale or a nursery tale, because it was a tale of the interior of the home, like those which make chairs and tables talk like elves. The old household gods of the Italian peasants seem to have been great, clumsy, wooden images, more featureless than the figurehead which Quilp battered with the poker. This religion of the home was very homely. Of course, there were other less human elements in the tangle of Italian mythology. There were Greek deities superimposed on the Roman. There were here and there uglier things underneath, experiments in the cruel kind of paganism, like the Erishian rite of the priest slaying the slayer. But these things are always potential in paganism. They are certainly not the peculiar character of Latin paganism. The peculiarity of what may be roughly covered by saying that if mythology personified the force of nature, this mythology personified nature as transformed by the forces of man. It was the god of the corn and not of the grass, of the cattle and not the wild things of the forest. In short, the cult was literally a culture, as when we speak of it as agriculture. With this there was a paradox which is still for many the puzzle or riddle of the Latins. With religion running through every domestic detail like a climbing plant, there went what seems to many the very opposite spirit, the spirit of revolt. Imperialists and reactionaries often involve Rome as the very model of order and obedience. But Rome was the very reverse. The real history of ancient Rome is much more like a history of modern Paris. It might be called in modern language a city built out of barricades. It is said that the gate of Janus was never closed because there was an eternal war without. It is almost as true that there was an eternal revolution within. From the first plebeian riots to the last servile wars, the state that imposed peace on the world was never really at peace. The rulers were themselves rebels. There is a real relation between this religion in private and this revolution in public life. Stories none the less heroic for being hackneyed remind us that the Republic was founded on a tyrannicide that avenged an insult to a wife, that the tribunes of the people were re-established after another, which avenged an insult to a daughter. The truth is that only men to whom the family is sacred will ever have a standard or a status by which to criticize the state. They alone can appeal to something more holy than the gods of the city, the gods of the hearth. That is why men are mystified in seeing that the same nations that are thought rigid in domesticity are also thought restless in politics. For instance, the Irish and the French. It is worthwhile to dwell on this domestic point because it is an exact example of what is meant here by the inside of history, like the inside of houses. The mere political histories of Rome may be right enough in saying that this or that was a cynical or cruel act of the Roman politicians. But the spirit that lifted Rome from beneath was the spirit of all Romans. It is not a call, an ideal of Cincinnatus passing from the Senate to the plow. Men, men of that sort had strengthened their village on every side, had extended its victories already over the Italians and even over Greeks, when they found themselves confronted with a war that changed the world. I've called it here the War of the Gods and Demons. There was established on the opposite coast of the inland sea a city that bore the name of the New Town. It was already much older, more powerful, and more prosperous than the Italian town, but there still remained about it an atmosphere that made the name not inappropriate. It had been called New because it was a colony like New York or New Zealand. It was an outpost or a settlement of the energy and expansion of the great commercial cities of Tyre and Sidon. There was a note of the new countries and colonies about it, a confident and commercial outlook. It was fond of saying things that rang with a certain metallic assurance, as that nobody could wash his hands in the sea without the leave of the new town, for it depended almost entirely on the greatness of its ships, as did the two great ports and markets from which its people came. It brought from Tyre and Sidon a prodigious talent for trade and considerable experience of travel. It brought other things as well. In a previous chapter I have hinted at something of the psychology that lies behind a certain type of religion. There was a tendency in those hungry for practical results, apart from poetical results, to call upon spirits of terror and compulsion, to move Acheron in despair of bending the gods. There is always a sort of dim idea that these darker powers will really do things, with no nonsense about it. In the interior psychology of the Punic peoples, this strange sort of pessimistic practicality had grown to great proportions. In the new town, which the Romans called Carthage, as in the parent cities of Phoenicia, the god who got things done bore the name of Moloch, who was perhaps identical with the other deity we know as Baal, the Lord. The Romans did not first quite know what to call him or what to make of him. They had to go back to the grossest myth of Greek or Roman origins and compare him to Saturn devouring his children. But the worshippers of Moloch were not gross or primitive. They were members of a mature and polished civilization, abounding in refinements and luxuries. They were probably far more civilized than the Romans, and Moloch was not a myth, or at any rate his meal was not a myth. These highly civilized people really met together to invoke the blessing of heaven on their empire by throwing hundreds of their infants into a large furnace. We can only realize the combination by imagining the number of Manchester merchants with chimney pot hats and mutton chop whiskers going to church every Sunday at 11 o'clock to see a baby roasted alive. The first stages of the political or commercial quarrel can be followed in far too much detail, precisely because it is merely political or commercial. The Punic Wars looked at one time as if they would never end, and it is not easy to say when they ever began. The Greeks and the Sicilians had already been fighting vaguely on the European side against the African city. Carthage had defeated Greece and conquered Sicily. Carthage had also planted herself firmly in Spain. Between the Spain and Sicily, the Latin city was contained and would have been crushed if the Romans had been of the sort to be easily crushed. Yet the interest of the story really consists in the fact that Rome was crushed. If there had not been certain moral elements as well as the material elements, the story would have ended where Carthage certainly thought it had ended. It is common enough to blame Rome for not making peace, but it was a true popular instinct that there could be no peace with that sort of people. It is common enough to blame the Roman for his delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed. It is a commoner to forget, to all appearance, Rome itself was destroyed. The sacred savor that hung around Rome forever, it is too often forgotten, clung to her partly because she had risen suddenly from the dead. Carthage was an aristocracy, as are most of such mercantile states. The pressures of the rich on the poor was impersonal as well as irresistible, for such aristocracies never permit personal government, which is perhaps why this one was jealous of personal talent. But genius can turn up anywhere, even in a governing class. As if to make the world's supreme test as terrible as possible, it was ordained that one of the great houses of Carthage should produce a man who came out of those gilded palaces with all the energy and originality of Napoleon coming from nowhere. At the worst crisis of the war, Rome learned that Italy itself, by a military miracle, was invaded from the north. Hannibal, the Grace of Baal, as his name ran in his own tongue, had dragged a ponderous chain of armaments over the starry solitudes of the Alps, and pointed southward to the city where he had been pledged by all his dreadful gods to destroy. Hannibal marched down the road to Rome, and the Romans who rushed to war with him felt as if they were fighting with a magician. Two great armies sank to right and left of him into the swamps of the Trebia. More and more were sucked into the horrible whirlpool of the Cannae. More and more went forth only to fall in ruin at his touch. The supreme sign of all disasters, which is treason, turned tribe after tribe against the falling cause of Rome, and still the unconquerable enemy rolled nearer and nearer to the city, and followed their great leader to the swelling cosmopolitan army of Carthage, passed like a pageant of the whole world, the elephants shaking the earth like marching mountains, and the gigantic Gauls with their barbaric panoply, and the dark Spaniards girt in gold, and the brown Numidians on their unbridled desert horses, wheeling and darting like hawks, and the whole mobs of deserters and mercenaries and miscellaneous people, and the grace of Baal that went with before them. Roman augurs and scribes, who said that in that hour that it brought forth unearthly prodigies, that a child was born with the head of an elephant, or that stars fell down like hailstones, had a far more philosophical grasp of what had really happened than the modern historian, who can see nothing in it but a success of strategy concluding a rivalry in commerce. Something far different was felt at the time and on the spot, as it was always felt by those who experience a foreign atmosphere entering their own like a fog or a foul savor. It was no mere military defeat. It was certainly no mere mercantile rivalry that filled the Roman imagination with such hideous omens of nature herself becoming unnatural. It was Moloch upon the mountains of the Latins, looking with his appalling face across the plain. It was Baal who trampled the vineyards with his feet of stone. It was the voice of Tanit the invisible, behind her trailing veils, whispering of the love that is more horrible than hate. The burning of the Italian cornfields, the ruin of the Italian vines, were something more than actual. They were allegorical. There were destruction of domestic and fruitful things, the withering of what was called human before that inhumanity that is far beyond the human thing called cruelty. The household gods bowed low in darkness under their lowly roofs. Above them went the demons upon a wind from beyond all walls, blowing the trumpet of the tramontane. The door of the Alps was broken down, and in no vulgar but very solemn sense it was hell let loose. The war of the gods and demons seemed already to have ended, and the gods were dead. The eagles were lost, the legions were broken, and in Rome nothing remained but honor and the cold courage of despair. In the whole world one thing still threatened Carthage, and that was Carthage. There was remained the inner working of an element strong in all successful commercial states, and the presence of a spirit that we know. There was still a solid sense of the shrewdness of the men who manage big enterprises. There was still the advice of the best financial experts. There was still business government. There was still the broad and sane outlook of practical men of affairs. And in these things could the Romans hope. As the war trailed on to what seemed its tragic end, there grew gradually a faint and strange possibility that even now they might not hope in vain. The plain business men of Carthage, thinking as such men do in terms of living and dying races, saw clearly that Rome was not only dying, but dead. The war was over. It was obviously hopeless for the Italian city to resist any longer, and inconceivable that anyone should resist when it was hopeless. Under these circumstances, another set of broad, sound business principles remained to be considered. Wars were waged with money, and consequently cost money. Perhaps they felt in their hearts, as do many of their kind, that after all war must be a little wicked because it costs money. By the time now had come for peace, and still more for economy. The messages sent by Hannibal from time to time asking for reinforcements were a ridiculous anachronism. There were much more important things to attend to now. It might be true that some consul or other made a last dash to the Metaurus, had killed Hannibal's brother and flung his head with Latin fury into Hannibal's camp, and mad actions of that sort showed how utterly hopeless the Latins felt about their cause. But even excitable Latins could not be so mad as to cling to a lost cause forever. So argued the best financial experts, and tossed aside more and more letters full of rather queer alarmist reports. So argued and acted the great Carthaginian Empire. That meaningless prejudice, the curse of commercial states, that stupidity is in some way practical, and that genius is in some way futile, led them to starve and abandon that great artist in the school of arms, whom the gods had given them in vain. Why do men entertain this queer idea that what is sordid must always overthrow what is magnanimous? That there is some dim connection between brains and brutality, or that it does not matter if a man is dull so long as he is also mean? Why do they vaguely think of all chivalry as sentiment and all sentiment as weakness? They do it because they like all men, primarily inspired by religion. For them, as for all men, the first fact is their notion of the nature of things, their idea about what world they are living in. And it is in their faith that the only ultimate thing is fear, and that the very heart of the world is evil. They believe that death is stronger than life, and therefore dead things must be stronger than living things, whether those dead things are gold and iron and machinery, or rocks and rivers and forces of nature. It may sound fanciful to say that men we meet at tea tables or talk to at garden parties are secretly worshippers of Baal or Moloch. But this sort of commercial mind has its own cosmic vision, and it is the vision of Carthage. It has in it the brutal blunder that this was the ruin of Carthage. The Punic power fell because there is in this materialism a mad indifference to real thought. By believing in the soul, it comes to disbelieving in the mind. Being too practical to be moral, it denies what every practical soldier calls the moral of an army. It fancies that money will fight when men will no longer fight. So it was with the Punic merchant princes. Their religion was a religion of despair, even when their practical fortunes were hopeful. How could they understand that the Romans could hope even when their fortunes were hopeless? Their religion was a religion of force and fear. How could they understand that men can still despise fear even when they submit to force? Their philosophy of the world had weariness in its very heart. Above all, they were weary of warfare. How should they understand those who still wage war even when they are weary of it? In a word, how should they understand the mind of man, who has for so long bowed down before mindless things, money and brute force and gods who had the hearts of beasts? They awoke suddenly to the news that the embers they had disdained too much even to tread out were again breaking everywhere into flames. That Hasdrubal was defeated, that Hannibal was outnumbered, that Scipio had carried the war into Spain, and that he had carried it into Africa. Before the very gates of the Golden City, Hannibal fought his last fight for it and lost, and Carthage fell as nothing had fallen since Satan. The name of the new city remains only as a name. There is no stone of it left upon the sand. Another war was indeed waged before the final destruction, but the destruction was final. Only men digging in its deep foundation century after found a heap of hundreds of little skeletons, the holy relics of that religion. For Carthage fell because she was faithful to her own philosophy and had followed out to its logical conclusion her own vision of the universe. Moloch had eaten his children. The gods had risen again, and the demons had been defeated after all. But they had been defeated by the defeated, and almost defeated by the dead. Nobody understands the romance of Rome, and why she rose afterwards to a representative leadership that seems almost fated and fundamentally natural. Who does not keep in mind the agony of horror and humiliation through which she had continued to testify to the sanity that is the soul of Europe? She came to alone in the midst of an empire because she had once stood alone in the midst of a ruin and a waste. After that, all men knew in their hearts that she had been representative of mankind, even when she was rejected of men. And there fell on her the shadow from a shining and as yet invisible light, and the burden of things to be. It is not for us to guess in what manner or the moment the mercy of God might in any case have rescued the world. But it is certain that the struggle which established Christendom would have been very different if there had been an empire of Carthage instead of an empire of Rome. We have to thank the patience of the Punic Wars if, in after ages, divine things descended at least upon human things and not inhuman. Europe evolved into its own vices and its own impotence, as will be suggested on another page, but the worse into which it evolved was not like what it had escaped. Can any man in his senses compare the great wooden doll, whom the children expected to eat a little bit of the dinner, with the great idol who would have been expected to eat the children? That is the measure of how far the world went astray, compared with how it might have gone astray. If the Romans were ruthless, it was in a true sense to an enemy, and certainly not merely a rival. They remembered not trade routes and regulations, but the faces of sneering men, and hated the hateful soul of Carthage. And we owe them something if we never needed to cut down the groves of Venus, exactly as men cut down the groves of Baal. We owe it partly to their harshness that our thoughts of our human past are not wholly harsh. If the passage from heathenry to Christianity was a bridge as well as a breach, we owe it to those who kept that heathenry human. If, after all these ages, we are in some sense at peace with paganism, and can think more kindly of our fathers, it is well to be remembered that were, and the things that might have been. For this reason alone, we can take lightly the load of antiquity, and need not shudder at a nymph on a fountain, or a Cupid on a Valentine. Laughter and sadness link us with things long passed away, and remember, without dishonor, that we could not see altogether without tenderness the twilight sinking around the Sabine farm, and hear the household gods rejoice when Catullus comes home to Sirmio. Deleta est Carthago.